Hey everyone, welcome to Marketing for Designers podcast. I'm your host, Masha Coyne, a messaging strategist and a copywriter for the interior design industry. I've been marketing for over 2 decades, working for some of the biggest global firms. Today, I write website copy for designers like you using my signature voice of customer framework. This podcast is a bit of a passion project for me. If you're a designer looking to up your marketing game, elevate your online presence, and attract premium clients, you are in the right place. I am so happy that you're here. This podcast is all about sharing marketing stuff that actually works. I'm talking with professionals who know the ins and outs of marketing, from SEO experts to website designers, PR pros, branding specialists, and many, many more. But here's the really exciting part. I've also persuaded some incredibly successful interior designers to open up about their marketing journeys. It's like we're sneaking a peek under the hood of their businesses. They'll be talking about their marketing strategies and tactics that worked, the bullets they dodged, and even the missteps they made along the way. So you don't have to. It's real and it's packed with juicy lessons you won't find anywhere else. And of course, there will be episodes with just you and I, where I'll break down the secrets of killer website copy and messaging, giving you all the tools you need to attract your dream clients. So settle in and let's get into it. Here's to elevating the marketing of your interior design brand. Okay, so when I talk to my interior design clients for the first time, or when we get into the strategy session that comes shortly after the discovery call, I get to hear their story and I get super excited if there is like a really clear differentiator or something about their experience, because that's the thing that sets them apart. And then, for a copywriter, it's so much easier to write about somebody who's got a clear differentiator. And then the next phase of the project is I go and research a little bit about them. I go on their website, I go on their social media, and I kind of fully expect to see that differentiator front and center across everything, because that's the thing that sets them apart from their competition. And oftentimes I don't find that. And then I realize, well, the reason why I don't find that is because people don't always know how to talk about what makes them different. So, and like I hear stories like the other day, I was talking to somebody like a commercial construction expert, and he's got 40 years of experience. I mean, not everybody can claim 40 years of experience, so that should be part of your marketing. So this is the topic today. How do you communicate what makes you different? And to talk about that, I feel like I brought the best guest on the show today. So let me introduce you to my guest, because that's what we're talking about. I bring you Jude Charles. For over 18 years, Jude has been producing documentaries for entrepreneurs. He has produced stories for Google, Steve Harvey, Niagara, who you all know very well, and dozens of visionary CEOs. Jude is the author of Dramatic Demonstration. This book is a roadmap that teaches you how to dig deep to find compelling stories that no one else knows, and then leverage those stories to grow your business. Jude, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Masha, I am excited to be here. It is a conversation long time coming.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm excited to be here.
Well, let's start there. True or false? Every business or every business owner has a differentiator. What do you think?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Because in the same way that every business has a differentiator, every person has a differentiator. We might have similar experiences, but no two people have the exact same story. And so, for example, Masha, both of us, we are in the interior design space, servicing other interior designers. But I got started in my business at a very young age, at 17 years old. I was in a TV production classroom when a teacher who taught me everything she knew about video production decided that she would come to me and say, Jude, you're really talented at video production. You should start a business. Oh. And I'm like, what does that mean? Start a business? I'm 17 years old at the time, youngest of 10 children. My father worked as a construction worker. My mom worked at a chair factory. I had no idea what it meant to be an entrepreneur. But the following day, I'll never forget, May 5th, 2006, Mrs. Donnelly walks in the classroom with a yellow envelope. And I'm like, what is this? She's like, look inside. And when I look inside of this yellow envelope, it is my very first set of business cards. And that is how I got started in helping entrepreneurs tell their story. Well, that moment, I never used to share that moment when I first got started because I thought it was no big deal. So what? A teacher gave me business cards. That moment is the beginning of my differentiator. The fact that I was 17 years old and was just like, okay, I'm going to take this risk to start a business. Oftentimes we tend to downplay the things that make us different. It's like, oh yeah, so what? That's not a big deal. And I think in the same way that businesses have a differentiator, they have a way that they got started. We as people, human beings, have differentiators. And that's where we should ultimately start.
I love that. And I love that you told that story. But more than that, I actually love that you found it relevant to tell that story, because a lot of us, like you said, we look at our careers before. Maybe not everybody started as an interior designer. Maybe some people started as something else. I worked in marketing at big consulting firm for the first 15 years of my career. And at first I was like, well, no, I'm now a copywriter. So that is completely irrelevant. That has nothing to do with what I do today. And then I did a little bit of digging. I was like, oh, okay. So there's certain skills that I brought here and, it's all relevant. But I wonder, so if people find themselves, where you were, how do they find what's relevant, what's not relevant? Is everything relevant that you've done in the past?
I think so. Everything is relevant. Everything is relevant because it's those unique set of experiences that have brought you to where you are today. So I'll take, for example, there's a client that I have, Jen Davidson. Before she became an interior designer, she was a flight attendant for 20 years.
Wow.
before ever becoming an interior designer. But it was that experience, customer service experience, that has allowed her to work with her clients in a way that she's very empathetic and she's very understanding. She takes the time to really get to understand who they are, their quirks, what they're about, so that she understands how to design their home, right? I think every single experience that we've had in our life is relevant. What makes it most relevant, so you asked me the question of how do we know what to share, is you just got to share it. You share it and figure out what people are what makes them lean in. The story that I just told you about Mrs. Donnelly, I never used to share. The first 5 years of my business, I never shared it. And then I remember one day I shared it, and then the person started asking me more questions. She's like, what? A teacher gave you business cards? And they were so fascinated by that. And then I tried it again. And again, it just got so many more questions that I'm like, oh, this is actually a thing that people care about. So I think it's taking the life experiences that you've had, sharing them, and seeing how people respond.
I like that. Okay, so that's a good start. So everything is relevant. You just have to figure out, I guess, a creative way to tell those stories. I'm assuming you're going to help us, figure out a way to tell those stories. But before that, how do you figure out? Let's say we've got this life experience, and my audience for this podcast is interior designers. How do they figure out what is something different about their business, or like you said, about themselves? Because it's not necessarily business related. It could be possibly something about them, like their personal brand. How do they figure out that differentiator?
I would start with, what is the one thing that people compliment on you most, right? So for example, when I'm having conversations with people, they always say, oh, you like to go really deep. Like you really like to ask really good questions, right? Now, I could look at that and say, oh, that's nothing. Yeah, that's just me. Or I could write that down, right? And then the next time, what's another different compliment that people give, right? There is a similarity with all the compliments that people give you. And I think that is where you start ultimately, is like, I don't know what makes me different. I don't know what makes me unique. I think maybe it's this, but I also think other people do that, right? Like I mentioned with me I ask really great questions. There might be other people that ask great questions, but there's no one that does it the way that you do it. And I've begun to realize that, and then I believed it. I think at a certain point, when you're running an interior design business, you're an entrepreneur, you have to decide you're going to be the boss. And what that means is that you have to believe it, own it, say it, and then share it.
Ooh. That's powerful.
So when someone gives you a compliment, believe it. Just believe it. Even if you feel like, oh, that was nothing, just believe it. Just decide you're going to believe it. Then when you decide to believe it, own that. Own that and share it with somebody else. You know what? I'm really great at whatever it is. I'm really great at asking questions. I'm really great at telling stories, right? So believe it, own it, say it, and then share it. And when you do that and you begin to own it and you say it and share it over and over and over, that is what allows other people to begin to believe, oh man, you know what? That's why I'm working with so and so. It's because they really go deep. On my Instagram, as of this recording, I had just done a podcast with Brad Lovett. And something I wasn't expecting to happen on the podcast with Brad Lovett is that he got choked up and as he was sharing a story, and he began to cry. And I wasn't expecting that. But one of the reasons that happened is because of what I just said. I asked really great questions. Although I was a guest on his podcast, we got to flip the script and I got to ask him questions. And in asking him them questions, it allowed him to open up and allowed him to share a story that he hadn't really shared before. Again, I could look at that and say, oh, that's nothing. That was just a coincidence, right? Or I could look at that and say, no, I'm really great at asking questions and I'm really great at getting people to open up and to get them to go deep. That's what makes me different. Even though I'm a filmmaker and I bring stories to life through video, what does asking questions have to do with that? Well, it's getting that person to open up, because then when you get them to open up, that's what allows them to have a great story to share. We start with the compliments, and you believe it, own it, say it, and share it.
I love it. And I actually agree with you that to get a really good, impactful answer, you actually have to ask the right question. So I wonder if I can steal a couple of your questions, because I feel like that would be interesting to know. What are some of the things, like let's say when you start working with interior designers or other entrepreneurs, and you obviously create these beautiful stories, some of them are very emotional. What are some of the questions? Just share a couple of questions that you ask that get people to open up. Maybe interior designers that are listening to this podcast episode can ask that, or can like self-reflect or journal about it.
Yeah, I'll start with the really basic ones. So first one is like, why do you do it that way? You have a process. Even if you don't have your process written down, you have a process of what you take your projects through, each one. Why do you do it that way? Why did you decide that's the way to do it? So that's number one. I think another one is, what are your strengths? What are you really good at that you get obsessed about? Like, you spend hours on this one thing that other people don't. Another question I like to ask is, where are you ultimately going? Right? If you could paint a picture of the road that you're going down right now, the final destination that you want to reach, where is it? And allow people's imagination to go. Sometimes they don't know the answer. Mm-hmm. Other times they do, and they've thought about it for a very long time as to what that perfect picture is for them. But I think those are some of the questions I like to ask. Sometimes it's very basic, like, why are you doing it this way? Other times it's very like, I'm looking at, what does the future look like? Or what does your imagination look like? The other thing too, that I think in asking people questions, I will share my own experience and then end it with, how would you think about that if you were going through that same experience? So for example, I worked with a builder who, before we started filming, he was very nervous about getting on camera. And he was nervous, and I didn't know it at the time, but because I know he's nervous, I can't put him on camera. So I'm like, you know what? Just take me to 3 different projects that you're doing right now. He took me to the different projects. We're talking in between. And then we get to lunch. And at lunch is when he finally reveals to me, he's like, yeah, I've been really nervous about this. I couldn't sleep the night before. And he was like, it's because of my accent. He is from Brazil. He has been in the States for 20 years, but he just feels like his accent, still comes off strong. I was like, I don't really have a problem understanding anything that you're saying. He's like, yeah, I know, but I'm still worried about it. And then 5 minutes into us eating, he looks back up at me and he's just like, you know what, to be honest with you, I'm afraid of embarrassing my wife and kids. And I was like, wow, okay. And I was like, I get it. You think you're going to sound silly. You may not say the words the exact way, but I was like, what if you're embarrassing your wife and kids by not showing up? What if your wife has all this belief in you and she's just waiting on you to have it? That story I share now when I am interacting with my clients or potential clients, and I'll say to them, you know what? What insecurities do you have? What is it that worries you about sitting in front of the camera and talking? Or what is it that worries you about even doing this whole entire project? That gets them, first of all, I shared a story with them, a very vulnerable story from someone else, but then it allows them to think about, oh, what is it like for me? I remember talking to an interior designer who was just like, you know what? After I shared that story with her, she was like, I service the luxury market, but I don't think my house is that luxury. So I'm a little worried about what my house will look like on camera. It's like, that's a very valid thing to feel insecure about, right? But the only reason she was willing to open up and be that vulnerable is because I shared another story that opened that door. And so I think it's another way to ask questions that gets people to go really deep.
And share a little bit of your experience. And I can relate to this so much. Like even, a year ago before I started this podcast, this is the thing that I was worried about. So, and I actually know exactly who you were talking about in this little scenario. But I similarly had the same concern because, I wasn't born in Canada, which is where I live. And I'm like, who am I as an immigrant to start like with an accent, with all the things, not being born here, not lived here for like 16 years of my life. Who am I to start a podcast? But it's interesting. I love that this is how you get people to open up, to kind of share a little bit of your story, a little bit of maybe somebody else's story, to get people to kind of see, hey, you're not alone. Like others are feeling the same way. And so that's amazing. I love that. So let's say they figure, okay, well, actually, how do we figure out our differentiator? So we've asked those questions, and maybe interior designers can reflect on those questions. Where do we go from here? We've asked, other people to comment on that. What are some of the things they compliment you on? Mm-hmm. Let's say they figured out, okay, this might be the thing. I'm really good at asking questions. Let's just go with that. Where do you go from there? How do you then share it and talk about it and communicate it? Because I feel like the more you communicate, the more you share that strength, the more people say, oh, okay, that's really what Jude is known for. How do we help others do that?
I've realized through experience that when you own it and you begin to tell other people this is the thing that makes you different, they believe it too. Mm-hmm. And when they believe it, then that's what they know you for. So in the exact same way that you were like, hey, oh, Jude is really great at asking questions. Okay, I really believe that. The second part of that is to demonstrate that. So someone has told you something that you're unique in, that makes you different. And you believe it now, you're owning it. But how do you demonstrate that? How do you show that? How do you say, oh, this is what makes me different? I got on this podcast, and one of the questions you asked me is like, oh, what are the questions you asked? I wasn't prepared for that necessarily, right. But because I own it, I just literally thought of, okay, what are the questions I just asked even, a week ago to a client that I was onboarding, right? And I demonstrate these are the questions, but I didn't just demonstrate and say, oh, these are the questions. Here's 3 questions that I asked and that's it. I walked you through that slowly. When people want to believe in who you are and what you do, you could say it, right? But hearing something said 1,000 times is not as powerful as seeing it once for yourself. I can tell you that I'm passionate about what I do. But then if I take the time to demonstrate that and to show you how I obsess about that, to show you that, I'll even give you another example. If I tell you I'm passionate about what I do and I obsess over it, part of me sitting here with you today, and the reason that I can articulate what I'm thinking and how I think about it, the reason I don't get flustered when you ask me a question that I'm not prepared for is because every single podcast I've been on, I go back and listen to it just so I can get better, right?
Oh, I like that. I should do that too, actually.
But again, that's demonstrating I'm not just passionate about coming on podcasts to tell my story or to allow people into my world. I'm studying it. I'm getting better at becoming a master of it. And so you want to believe what people are saying to you. So be the boss, believe it, own it, say it, share it, but then demonstrate that. bring people behind the scenes of what you're doing to make that better. That whatever that thing is, that's your differentiator. Bring people behind the scenes. The other thing is just continue to share that over and over and over. The reason you know that story that I shared earlier is because I shared that on Instagram, right? And I shared it every time I'm on a podcast. I shared that. Continue to share that over and over. That's how people believe it too. It's like a commercial. You are known for this thing. You see the commercial 100 times. When now the next time you want that thing, you're going to remember that brand, right? And so in the same way, when we have a differentiator, not just believe it, own it, say it, share it, but then demonstrate that. Bring people into your world so that they can believe it too.
I love that. Okay, I want to talk more about behind the scenes, because I feel like we know we should be doing that. We know we should be, telling people about our process. If you're an interior designer, bringing people on site, showing them how you make decisions or creative brainstorming and all the things. Is there like a step-by-step process, or where do we start to do that? It's not like just turning on your camera. It's like, okay, follow me for the day. This is what I do all day long. Like, obviously it has to be a bit more strategic than that.
Yeah, so I would start with what I call choreographed behind the scenes. Choreographed behind the scenes is similar to if you ever watched MTV Cribs or you watch HGTV now, where they walk you through the home. Think about, there's a home that you're working on. What are you actually doing in that home? So let's just say, for example, you're remodeling the kitchen. Okay, what about this kitchen that you're remodeling? Think about that before you ever turn on the camera. What is it that you're actually doing in this kitchen? And then that way, when you turn on the camera, you have something that you know what you're talking about. What makes that kitchen unique? What backsplash are you actually putting in that kitchen? Or maybe it's the range that is a very fancy range. Like, tell me about it. What makes it great? What makes it unique? You want to think through it before you ever turn on the camera. So that's called choreographed behind the scenes. Now, there's another behind the scenes that I call raw behind the scenes, and that is just turning on the camera and you never know what's going to happen that day, right? But you go to a site visit, and let's say you're building a home from the ground up, and there's only the studs right now, right? The framing of the house. But you're walking through to think through what the rest of the house will look like. You have one of the site visits. Just turn on the camera and record it. Maybe you don't go live, but you're recording that. And sometimes there'll be things that you're not even preparing for to happen, but it happens, and at least you captured it on camera. So that's raw behind the scenes. And then there's personal behind the scenes. Personal behind the scenes sometimes actually doesn't have to do with your project as much as something really cool just happened. You turn on the camera and you're just filming it to document it, but then you go back later on and you talk about what you just filmed or why you filmed this certain thing. When I am filming with clients, for example, Jen Davidson, which is one of my latest docuseries, she's an interior designer out of Chicago. We went and visited 5 different projects. Now, on one of the projects, she was doing a site visit to get through to think through the furnishings of this home. But as part of that, the project manager showed up and they needed to go over paint colors, specifically white. There's these white cabinets going on a white wall, and they want to make sure they had the right color white. Just capture that. It wasn't exactly planned. It wasn't like, oh, we knew Andrea, the project manager, would be there, but I didn't know this conversation was going to happen. We just filmed it. Ended up being a great scene for Andrea to explain how they have great synergy. Andrea explained how, you know what, we could email all day long, but sometimes we need to be on site to really see what this is going to look like, right? Now I could tell you that, but now I'm showing it to you. And that's behind the scenes. You're able to really bring people into your world, into the experience. It's not just about the finished product. It's also the journey that gets to the finished product. And I think that's why behind the scenes is so important.
You also mentioned that when you were documenting whatever it is, whether it's behind the scenes or something personal, it doesn't have to be business related. It doesn't have to be interior design project related. Is there like a ratio, like a benchmark of how much of what's something personal that you share on your social media, in your marketing, wherever, and then business stuff? Is there like a, 80-20 rule or something like that?
I would go 80-20. And the reason for that, so the 80-20 rule is a real principle, right? That the 20% of your results, 20%
Totally
of your
guessed it, by the
input,
way.
20% of your input, it gives you the 80% of your results. I believe that 20% of your personal brand, your personal story, your personal life gives you 80% of the results. Because as of this recording, there are literally hundreds of thousands of interior designers, right? There are hundreds of thousands of interior designers. But what makes one different from the other, right? What makes you different is you. There are designers that can talk about they do renderings in advance. Okay, great. There are designers that's going to say, I'm going to hold your hand through this process. Okay, great. But what else? What else is there that makes you you? What makes you stand out? It is your life, your personal life, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you overshare and you are always showing your family, your kids, your husband, your wife. But it does mean that every now and then you're talking about something that happened in your personal life that relates back to interior design. So I mentioned that I am really great at asking questions, right? Now, again, I mentioned that might not necessarily relate to someone who is thinking about hiring me as a filmmaker. It's like, okay, great. He likes asking great questions. Okay, cool. There's a story that I share about a time that I went skydiving, and it was my 30th birthday, and my girlfriend at the time surprised me with 2 tickets to go skydiving. And I didn't know it at the time. I ended up driving to this executive airport, but I didn't know where I was headed. My girlfriend just told me, wear comfortable clothes. We're going out. We're going to enjoy your birthday. And it wasn't until I was pulling up to the executive airport that this thing I had been talking about for 4 years of doing, which was skydiving, was actually happening. Now, there was a reason I was only talking about doing it. Mm-hmm. We walk up to the counter of this skydiving center, and no lie, Masha, you walk up to the counter, they hand you 5 pages of paperwork, and on each page, it reminds you might die. And I'm thinking to myself, why did I want to do this again? Mm-hmm. So the rest of this is a blur. I'm walking to the airplane goes up in the air. All of that is a blur up until my instructor, who I'm strapped to because it's tandem skydiving, pushes us out of the airplane and I'm falling 10,000 feet in the air. Well, obviously, I'm talking to you today, so I landed safely. What I like to tell my clients is that when we start to work together, I'm going to ask you really deep questions. It's going to feel as scary as skydiving because they're questions you might not have ever been asked before. But I want you to trust, in the same way that I landed on 2 feet and skydiving was one of the best experiences of my life, that this is going to be an amazing experience for mm-hmm. me as well, for you as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's going through that process of like, not just, hey, this is the thing that I'm great at, but can I bring you into my world? I brought you into a personal experience that happened when I was turning 30. It was a personal experience. It doesn't have anything to do with filmmaking, but it brought you into my world. And that now, you know something about me, that I went skydiving, right? You know that I was scared out of my mind before I went skydiving, but now it helps us relate to each other. That 20% is the thing that helps people to see that you're the only option for them to work with. Not just one of the options, the only. Because now they know who you are, they know what you're about, and it allows them to just get a peek into your life. They don't need to know your deepest, darkest secrets, right? But they do need to understand beyond your expertise. Okay, you're really good at doing that. Great. Are we aligned, though? Are we 2 people that are going to have a great experience? Because building a home or even remodeling a home is a long process. It's not just 1 week. It might be 6 months to a year, sometimes 5 years. Are we people that are going to gel? Are we going to get along? Are we going to align? Are you someone I can trust? That's mm-hmm. the 20 to 80%. You want to share 20% of that, and then 80% is the rest of your expertise.
Okay, so we share personal stuff is to help people trust us, to get people to trust us. So I like that. You are someone that seems to have a story for everything. I feel like my dad was like that. Every time we were at a dinner table, whatever we were talking about, every time we would say something or there was a word or whatever, it's like, oh, I got a joke about it, or I got to think about it. There was always story after story after story. Obviously, he had it in his mind. I'm wondering, do you have like a system of capturing these stories? Like, that's part one question. Like, how do you collect these stories? Certainly they're not just like in your head and like you're referencing them at the right time, but also you said something earlier, then you tie it to something like interior design or something else. Like you make it, I guess you explain why this story is important, or whether it's a lesson learned or something else. How would you recommend we collect these stories? And then what's that other work that we need to do in order to make it relevant?
A story is a retelling of a very specific moment in time. But the most important part of retelling that specific moment is the lesson that you learn. So you actually hit it on the head. That's exactly what a story is. So as we're talking, I'm thinking through, okay, I know I'm sharing statements and I'm sharing ideas. That's the lesson learned. But I really want to work backwards and get you to understand what I'm saying, right? I do have a system for how I go about doing that. I capture stories almost every day, just random moments that happen to me that I put into a story bank. So in the same way that we go to the bank and we deposit money, when you go to that same bank to withdraw money, you can only withdraw what you've deposited. So that's why for me, I spend almost every day thinking about what happened today. What experiences did I go through today that might, at some point later on, I might be able to use and share to be able to illustrate a point or an example much better, right? And so I will literally write out a title. There's 3 things I do in the story bank. I'll write out the title. Title will be real random. It doesn't necessarily need to be perfect, but let's say for my 30th birthday, it might be skydiving. Random title, right? Then I'll write out exactly what happened. So went, just like I told you the story, I got surprised, went, whole moment was a blur, but I landed on 2 feet. Just bullet point notes. Then I think about what are possible lessons for this. Now, I use that when I'm interacting with clients to get them to trust me through the process, or just trust the process, right? Other times I'll use it to, like I've used it before where I talk about core values and how core values are important. One of my core values is adventure. And so I'll say, I'll go through the skydiving story and I'll talk about how I like doing adventures like that. That's the lesson at the end. So I think through what are the possible different lessons. That way, when I am talking to someone, I could just go back into my mind and think, oh, okay, we're talking about this one thing here. What's a story that I have for that, right? Or if I'm sitting across from a client, and maybe I didn't share a story, but I realized they're just not understanding what I'm really talking about here. We've talked about it once. We might have talked about it a second time. They're just not really getting it. The third time, I'll literally begin to tell a story so that the story will help bring the point across. And usually that works. And that's why, like you mentioned, I have almost a story for just about everything that, I'm thinking of how can I communicate this idea in a much better way so that others, they won't just hear what I'm saying. They'll be able to learn it and then be able to apply it. It's one thing to just give you a statement, but the statement means nothing without context. So the context that I try to give is the actual story, a moment in time, and then the lesson that I learned in that moment in time.
I like that. And I feel like you just settled that argument that stories do help us illustrate our points so much better. So you should be telling those stories. The question is, how do we figure out what stories are worth telling? Like, how would you say that? Would you recommend that people do what you do, maybe reflect at the end of the day, maybe journal and kind of see, okay, what happened today? And then eventually by the end of the week, by the end of the month, you have a collection of stories. Or is there another kind of strategic exercise? I was like, okay, what stories should I be telling? Because I've heard, on my other podcast episodes, I've had guests who talked about, well, you should always be sharing your founding story and your, process story and all the other stories. Do you have a set of absolutely mandatory stories that you should be sharing so your marketing is effective?
Yeah, I do. I have what I call my origin story. So that's the story of Mrs. Donnelly and how I got started. I have a transition story. So a major transition that I had, which was, I won't tell the story now, but when my first 5 years in business, I failed, and what helped me get across to continuing after 5 years. And then I have client success stories. Mm-hmm. Right. So those are clients that I've helped. Like I told the story of the builder who had the accent. it's not necessarily about getting the finished product like the film and then he's able to make hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's about the fact that I helped him in this very specific moment where we were working together and it got him the result of finishing the project. And then finally, I have my why story. So my why story is, why do I do what I do? My mission and purpose is to lead and empower entrepreneurs to have relentless courage. And I have a story that I share for you for that. But to answer your point very directly, I think that you'll never really know what story works unless you start sharing it. I think for interior designers specifically, most interior designers have these meetings every Monday or Tuesday where they will kind of go over all the projects that they have going on right now. Well, all of those projects have one thing in common. It doesn't matter what kind of interior designer you are. It doesn't matter if you're hospitality, residential, commercial. Every single project has a challenge. That challenge is a story. The actual challenge, but then how did you overcome the challenge? How you overcame the challenge is the lesson. So the challenge is a very specific moment in time, and then how you overcome that challenge, which is the lesson. When you are speaking with potential clients, people that are thinking about hiring you, you can use those challenges to show them how you solve problems. Because ultimately, as an entrepreneur, as an interior designer, your number one job is to get to the finish line. How do you get to that finish line? Solve problems. There are going to be hundreds of problems that arise, but you know how to solve it because you've been here before.
Mm-hmm. And that almost becomes like a case study. Like
and it becomes a case study.
Showcasing the case study. You're showcasing the problem, how you solved it, and the result. And then people who may be in a similar situation are like, oh, okay. So that clearly shows me that she or he knows how to handle a similar situation and may have a creative solution for that.
Right, exactly. And so you share those stories over and over, and you realize which ones are relevant and which ones relate to your type of client more. So the story that I shared about the builder with the accent, I didn't know if that would work. I didn't know if it was a special story. I kind of had an idea, but it wasn't until I began sharing it over and over. I literally shared this probably an hour before we got on a call. And before we started recording, I shared this. And the person heard it and they were like, because I asked them, well, what did you feel as I told you this story? And they were like, honestly, I hear that story, but I'm thinking of me because I've had doubts of my own accent. You said that when moving to Canada, right? That's the only reason I know it works is because I'm listening to the feedback of, oh, it actually does resonate. I think it resonates. I think it's kind of cool story, but does it really? I won't know until I try it. Mm-hmm. That comes through repetition. You will never know what works unless you try it. And because I take the time to write the stories down, it's in my story bank, but it's also in my memory bank now. And I can pull that if I'm trying to explain something and then see if it works. And if it doesn't, which happens sometimes, it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. I don't use it again.
Right.
But because I know it works, that's why it's easier for me to tell some of these stories because I've tried them and I've tested them out. Try them one-on-one and then try them out when you're speaking or trying them out when you're talking to your team or talking to vendors even. When you're trying to get a vendor to understand a specific problem that you're having, tell them a story about why it's important that you guys solve this and solve this for this client. Maybe you tell the story of what makes this client special and what they're going through. That's how you get buy-in, but you got to try it. You got to share that story, and that's the only way that you know if it works or not.
Mm-hmm. So what comes to mind is that obviously you have to share it a lot in order for that to resonate and for people to kind of start associating you with that thing, whatever you're sharing. What's too much? Like, how often should we share? For example, your origin story. How often would you say you're sharing that? Let's say if Instagram is your main means of communication, or maybe it's something else. How often is good enough? Like, it's because sometimes it's too much. Like, I don't know if I should be sharing that every month or every couple of months, because obviously you've got new audience coming in. And so what would you say to that?
To your point at the end, that's exactly it. You have new audiences coming to you all the time. And just because you shared it doesn't mean everybody saw it. So I am constantly sharing over and over. I'm not assuming that this person knows the story. Even if they've referenced a podcast I've been on, I'm still going to share the story
Mm-hmm.
because we are inundated with technology, social media, email. There's thousands of messages going through that person's mind. Just because I shared my story doesn't mean they remember it. Now, many people remember the Mrs. Donnelly story because it's a really cool, unique thing that a teacher gave me business cards. But just like you go back and watch old movies or you play that same song that you just enjoy listening to, your audience enjoys hearing that story again. It's a reminder of something, right? And so that's why I'm constantly sharing my stories over and over. I'm constantly there's a message that I have. There's a message that you have. And that message will only be remembered if you keep repeating it. If you don't repeat it, no one knows you for that thing. That thing that you want to be known for, you want to be known as a great interior designer that does this very specific thing. No one will know you unless you continue to share that very specific thing. Part of why I get on podcasts to share my stories because I do want to get much better at storytelling. I think I'm good. I think I'm decent now. I think I could be better. I think there might be unique angles on how I tell a story that might actually work better. But I share it over and over and over. And sometimes I'm testing out new stories. It's kind of like a comedian. Comedians go to these small bars to test out their jokes before they ever do like a grand show, like on Madison Square Garden or something like that. But they're testing it over and over to see if it lands with different audiences, to see how it works. I don't think there's a such thing as sharing too much times. If anything, the person, I don't think they continue to scroll past it. They just sit there and listen to it as if they've heard it for the first time. I remember I did a talk with Rick Campos. He had an event and I was doing this talk, and there's a story that I share about working with my team, and our equipment got robbed. We got robbed of equipment, $20,000 worth of equipment. And I remember the moment I started the first couple lines of that story, because he's heard it before. I'm standing in front, or sitting in the front of the room with Rick. It was a fireside chat. And I began to tell the story, and he's like, "Ooh, that story. Okay, great. Yes." Right? In the same way, I think that your audience, your people that are paying attention to you, yes, they might have heard it before, but it doesn't take away from it's a great story that people enjoy listening to. It's a great message that people need to be reminded of. So I think it's never such a thing as oversharing.
As soon as you started talking about your stolen equipment, I realized that I heard that story because when I was attending Luann Live, that's where I heard that story, right? I think you shared it there. Yep. But it's true. People love hearing that. That kind of reminds me when me and my husband met on a blind date like 100 years ago. And that's, every time we start that story, our friends love hearing it. Because as soon as we say Starbucks, because that's where we met. It's like, oh, I know that story. So I love that. So if anybody's listening to this podcast episode is worried about posting, too often on this one thing that makes you different, this is your permission that you can totally do that. And that's probably one of the most impactful ways for people to actually come away knowing that, oh, okay, this is what you want to be known for. This is one of your strengths and differentiators.
Yeah, absolutely. It's we live in a time where it is more accessible than ever to film something great on your cell phone, to have decent audio, and to be able to share that with a wide audience. The one thing that holds us back is ourselves. The only limitation you have is the one that you create. So even thinking of, oh, I already shared that, that's a limitation, but you created it. No one else is telling you, hey, you share that too many times.
Right.
No one.
It's like a self-imposed limitation.
It's a self-imposed limitation. The only limitation you have is the one that you create. And I think it is far more important to continue to share your story, to make sure that that one person that needs to hear it are able to receive that message. You never know what someone needs that day. And it might be a story that you shared already, but they need a reminder because it's a day that they're having that they feel really low. And they're just like, I need to hear this. I'll wrap up with this one story of something that happened to me recently. while working in Chicago, the last day, I got this very long email from a person that's on my newsletter. And the very first line is what got me. It's a long email, but the first line is what got me to keep reading. And it said, "My father passed away a week after walking me down the aisle." I was like, okay, where is she going with this? And she begins to tell me the story of how her dad died in 2010, but her uncle, which was her dad's brother, recently passed away. And she feels like she's losing this connection to her dad. Her dad, about a month before he passed away, he used to wear this hat. And on the hat, it said, "Life is good." But she never understood why her dad would wear this hat, because her dad wasn't a guy that wore a hat. Well, she lost her uncle. She's kind of going through this moment where she's trying to figure out like this connection. She feels like she's losing it. And Masha, she decides to look up onto her podcast app my name, Jude Charles. Now, I don't have a podcast. Yes, I've been a guest on many podcasts, but I don't have a podcast. And I'm thinking to myself as I read that, why is she looking up my name? She said she needed to hear a calming voice that's familiar, calming voice. I've never met her. She's just only heard me on podcasts. And she decides to listen to a podcast. She's in a drapery business, but she decides to listen to a podcast called, I think it was like How to Grow Your Etsy Business. And I was a guest on there, but this has nothing to do with her business. Like, why is she deciding to listen to that one? Well, this is an hour-long podcast. And in the last 2 minutes of this podcast, the host asked me, "What book are you reading right now?" And I wanted to grab the book, but she asked me, "What book are you reading right now?" And I told her 2 different books, and she was like, "Well, there's this book I want to send you." And she's like, "A book I think you'll really enjoy." And I don't know if you can see the title of that book. The title of the book is called Life is Good. Life is Good is a brand. And this woman never knew that it was a brand that her dad was wearing. But what are the odds that this lady, in her moment of like just needing an uplifting moment, an uplifting spirit, a calming spirit, she looks up my name? And what are the odds that the podcast she decides to listen to in the last 2 minutes of this podcast? It's not even what we were talking about the whole entire show, but in the last 2 minutes, this Life is Good brand comes up that I didn't bring up, but someone else brought up. And it was just like, I want to share this with you, that this is what this lady needed in her moment, right? We take for granted, I included, take for granted sometimes resharing over and over the thing that you might have shared before, but it's what people actually need. And you'll never know the moment they need it. But the moment you decide to share it, even though it's the 10th, the 15th, the 100th time that you shared it, it's when they needed it most. I cried reading that email because I took for granted the voice, the impact of my voice. Of course, I get on here and I talk about storytelling and I talk about all these other things that are related to business. Sometimes I'll share things that are personal that other people need to understand, okay, I can make it through, or I can get to this next step. It's hard right now, but it'll be easier down the road, right? So I don't think there's ever a moment to not share. I don't think there's ever a moment you need permission to say, hey, share this today. Like, the only limitation you have is the one that you create. Don't create the limitation that you are sharing too much. The world needs you, and it's time to stop playing small.
Oh, this is great. And you do have a soothing voice. I feel like you need a meditation app of some sort and just put it out there. And, we all can listen to that. Well, we need to just, a bit of a zen in our life. Jude, before I let you go, I want to ask you if you could talk for a couple of minutes about your docuseries. I've seen a couple, and I think they're so powerful. And I think it takes tremendous skill to decide what stories make the cut. How do you even decide? Because it feels like, oh my God, how did you even come up with that plot and sharing a little bit of personal, a little bit of business? I want you to talk about your docuseries. Like, why are they so impactful? Why would people do that? Why is this great marketing?
Yeah, it is important to give others a 3-dimensional view into your world. And not many people know how to do that. Just like you're asking the questions like, what makes us different? Or how do we figure that out? The clients that come to me are looking to play at a higher level, and they're looking to grow their business, specifically interior designers, right? I've worked with 4 interior designers last year who worked on their docuseries and sharing not only how they got started, but where they are today. And how I go about doing that is that I do something called a road mapping strategy session. In the very beginning, before we ever press record, I will sit with that client for 3 hours and just ask them a lot of questions to get really at the core of who they are. So their core beliefs, their core values, and their core stories. That's what makes up that 3-dimensional view that I then turn into a dramatic demonstration. There are 5 different dramatic demonstrations: behind the scenes, live illustration, social proof, unique mechanism, and transformation. Ultimately, I'm looking to show all these words that they told me. So let's say if their core value is integrity, or their core value is community, or their core value is leadership, is that true? And I look to show that through a dramatic demonstration that this is true, right? And so that's how I go about creating these docuseries. I work with interior designers. I work with other entrepreneurs, other type of entrepreneurs, architects, builders, to help them bring to life their story in a very dramatic way. People work with people that they know, like, and trust. How do they get to know who you are, like what you have to say, and trust that you could provide a solution to their needs? I do it through storytelling, through specifically video storytelling, but I think we all have an opportunity to do that now. There's nothing holding you back. Sitting on a podcast is an opportunity for me to tell that story. But that's how I go about creating docuseries. I get really deep. I get to really know who that entrepreneur is. So I can then, me and my team can then document that and bring it to life. If you haven't already watched Luann Niagara's docuseries, it's probably one of the most impactful ones that I've done, but there's others. And I share that on my website, judecharles.co, that you could see. But that is how I go about creating these docuseries, is ultimately helping these entrepreneurs share their story so they can get bigger opportunities. They can grow their business, but also get bigger opportunities. Maybe they want to become speakers, or they want to work with brands and get licensing deals. We work together to craft that story, package it up so that now when you go to knock on that door is easier to open, and people feel like they know you before they ever really meet you because they've seen your story.
Amazing. I love it. Love it. Love it. Jude, I lied. This was not the last question, but the last question is, and I ask that on every episode, is what's the one habit or practice that you've implemented in your life or in your business that has been game changing for you?
Oh, you said one. I'm going to give you 2.
Sure.
Every year for 2 months, I take 2 months off. June and December. I take the full month off. I do not work. It's called my sabbatical. The reason I started that is because a long time ago, back in 2013, I realized I just needed that time off. I'm an introvert, believe it or not, and I knew that I needed that downtime. Well, in 2020, I burnt out. I woke up one morning, and I'll never forget October 10th, 2020, that when I woke up, my eyes opened, but I could not physically move my body. I was paralyzed from the waist down, from the neck down. And it wasn't until later that I got diagnosed with burnout, depression, and anxiety. But I realized the most important thing that I needed to do was those 2 months off, June and December. I used to do it November, December when I first started. Now it's June and December because I work 5 months, take 1 month off. So that's the first thing, take time off. I recommend at the very least 3 weeks consecutively. Second thing, though, is that's game changer for me, reading books all the time. I at first started through like self-help books or just regular like system books. Like one of my favorite books is The One Thing. But lately I've been reading a lot of biographies, and those biographies of people that have done great things allows me to see how they get through challenges too. And so I'm constantly reading. I read about 30 to 40 books a year at this point. But I'm reading to learn. I'm reading to take in. I'm reading to see things from a different perspective. Again, the only limitation you have is the one that you create. Perspective can create a limitation. And so I'm always opening my mind to new things, seeing things in a different way that I haven't seen it before. And so those are the 2 things: take time off and read books.
Amazing. Such great advice. I love it. Sign me up. I'm definitely looking forward to taking some time off. This is like this is something we all aspire to do. That's amazing. Jude, thank you so much for sharing. There's been so many takeaways. I've written down a whole bunch of stuff. I'm definitely going to rewatch this, re-listen to it. There's so many takeaways. You provided so much value. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Masha. It was definitely fun. You asked a lot of great questions too that I wasn't prepared for, but we had a lot of fun doing this.
So well. Yes, you're a pro. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Marketing for Designers. This is Masha Cohen signing off. See you next week.